All right, everyone. Hello. I think we'll get started. Thank you for attending today's talk, this special lecture on this fine Friday afternoon. This lecture is part of the Modern Languages and Linguistics lecture series, sponsored by the Linguistics Institute and the Department of Religion Bartholomew's lecture series, with co-sponsorship from the Department of History, the Department of English's Language, Culture and Media program. So there's a lot of support for today's talk. And then I'm going to introduce today's speaker. My name is Matt Winnie. I'm coordinator of the Japanese program here at FSU. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dennis Washburn, who is Burlington Northern Foundation Professor in Asian Studies at Dartmouth College, where he teaches Japanese literature and culture, Japanese film, translation, and comparative literature. Not so long ago, Dr. Washburn also served as Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Dartmouth. Dr. Washburn is the author of many works of scholarship and translation. He is the most recent translator, as we all know, of the 11th century work, The Tale of Genji, which was published by Norton in 2015. Since then, his translation has appeared in several series by Norton, including the nice Norton Critical Edition, right here, and the Norton Anthology of World Literature. The Tale of Genji has gathered nationwide attention recently, appearing in 2 pieces in the New York Times last weekend. Motoko Rich, the Times Tokyo bureau chief, writes that Dr. Washburn's translation is, quote, the most readable and the best for understanding the book at a plot level, unquote. To add on to Rich's remarks, reading the Genji through Washburn's translation has been a true joy. This semester, my students and many are here. Good to see you. And also students from 2 years ago. Also very happy to see you. We read all 41 chapters that make up what's known as Part 1 of the Tale of Genji, which is nearly 900 pages. And we finished just yesterday. Yes. As one student remarked in the class, even though the novel was written 1,000 years ago, it never fails to remind us of our humanity. Such a remark speaks to the Tale of Genji as a true literary masterpiece. And today, Dr. Washburn will show us more of the Genji's greatness. His lecture is titled, Death is the Mother of Beauty, Sublime Aesthetics in the Tale of Genji. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Dennis Washburn.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to the department for the invitation. It's really nice to be somewhere where there's heat. I'm coming in from New Hampshire, and it's a struggle getting above 40 degrees there. This is really a treat for me. And also, thanks to the students, I can say kokoro sama deshita. You worked through 900 pages of this, and I'm pleased that you worked with my work. Can I just say that? Is it? Okay, can you hear in the back? Can you hear me if I'm not using? Okay, I'll use the back. I'm a stroller. I'm a stalker in class, so maybe so I'll stand here. Try to be good. All right. So anyway, but anyway, as I said, I'm appreciative to Matt for using the translation. I hope you enjoyed it. It is a piece of literature. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about it. Now, can I just get a show of hands? How many of you have not read any of them? Okay, because I'm good. All right, so I modified my talk a bit because I want to give some background to the book first. And then I want to say something about what I'm going to be working on right now as a project on, is a survey of Japanese aesthetics looking at the notion of the sublime in Japanese aesthetics. But the book I'm working on is also more of a personal memoir of my reading of texts like this and trying to explain why I'm kind of obsessed with things that are excessive and sublime in the Japanese literary world. One last thing here before I get started. I'm not trying to be up to date or anything like this by using, you'll see sometimes I'm using manga versions of it. The simple truth is, and this is great, let me see this. There we go. Yamato Maki She was included in Melissa McCormick's wonderful exhibition of Genji art at the Met Museum in 2019. This book probably sold a hell of a lot more than versions of the Tale of Genji in Japan. And the reason I'm mentioning this is as we talk about the history of the reception of this is how people read it. Okay, so those of you who've gone through the 900 pages, you've probably done more than most Japanese have read. That's a simple fact. They read it in like high school, they'll read like particularly the first chapter, they'll do some study because they have to do bungo. But the fact is most people in Japan get it through other sources. They get it through film, through manga, through anime. There's several really good anime. So when I'm referring to this and using these sorts of slides, it's because we're talking about an aesthetics that isn't just 1,000 years old. It's an aesthetics that lives now in Japan, as Motoko Rich's article pointed out. So where I want to, I'm not sure why this, I'll try. So what I want to do is say one thing about how I'm approaching the work and what the title is. I feel like when you look at this work, it's redolent of a particular structure of feeling at the Heian court. That there was this fundamental contradiction that you see played out through the book all the way through between the beauty of things that are ephemeral. I just came back from Japan, the cherry blossoms were there, they were stunning and all of that. But as all of you know, it's almost a stereotype now. The cherry blossoms are this symbol of immense beauty because they're ephemeral, because they pass. Right? And so what happened, I think, at the court is that you had all of these competing ideologies, competing political factions, competing notions of aesthetics and what was beautiful, what mattered to the court. And for the court itself, the justification for the legitimization of the court was grounded in this appreciation of the here and now. But at the same time, as you've all seen, those of you who've read the book, there's a very, very strong underpinning of Buddhist ideology throughout. And in that, it puts this emphasis, as you see over and over again, over the centuries of Japanese aesthetics, that it's the moment of passing. And at the extreme of that, it's the notion of death that is the sort of epitome. It's the place where beauty really comes into its most sublime manifestation. And so my title here is taken from Sunday Morning, Wallace Stevens, a beautiful poem. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's about meditation. It's a woman sitting in her peignoir. She's got some coffee and oranges, and she's not going to church on Sunday morning. And she's wondering about, about these things. Why should she give herself over to these sorts of religious feelings? But she also wonders, isn't there something that is more permanent that I can hold on to? And this is the line that follows that part of the poem. Death is the mother of beauty, hence from her alone shall come fulfillment of our dreams and our desires. And this notion of death as the sort of trigger, if you will, the sort of starting point of a kind of sublime beauty is not unusual at all in Western art. You can look at Virgil. In the Aeneid, there's this phrase, lacrimae rerum, the tears of things, okay? That there's an inherent sorrow in the world. Most of you who studied this also know this term aware, which also means sorrow, but it can also mean beautiful. It's a very fungible word, actually. And so you see this sort of early in Western aesthetics, and here you have a very famous quotation from Edgar Allan Poe. When it most closely aligns itself to beauty, the death then of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world. And equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover. Those are his words. There's no mistakes there. So the lips best suited are those of a bereaved lover. This sort of captures one element of the sublime that I'm going to end up talking about when I get to the end of my talk. I see in the Genji a kind of Gothic sublimity, and I'm going to be interested to hear from those of you who've read the book how you thought about those passages where particularly there are supernatural elements, where there are really what I would consider Gothic or excessive, overdone elements in the book. And it all starts with the very first, there's like 800 poems in the entire text. And the first poem that appears is Genji's mother. And she's dying. And these are the only words you hear from her. Now in deepest sorrow, as I contemplate our diverging roads, this fork where we must part, how I long to walk the path of the living. And it's that moment that really sets that sets the course of the entire, I always want to say novel, monogatari, of this entire story. Because even though that's the only words we get from her, she is the ideal beauty in this text all the way through. Her presence is like a specter that haunts this text. It's all the way through. So before I go into this, I want to say, I'm not going to read all these bulleted points, just take a look at them. I just want to say a couple of things about Murasaki Shikibu, who is the author. One thing that is it's like Shakespeare. Did Shakespeare really write Shakespeare's plays? There's an argument as to whether she wrote the last chapters, the Uji chapters. And they are stylistically different. All right, so that's for sure. However, there's nobody else writing at the time who was writing like this. And very early on, within 2 decades, we know that there are references to her 54 chapters. This is by the 1030s, that we have references to her 54 chapters. So my feeling is like it's Occam's razor. Whatever's a simpler explanation is probably the best explanation. And that is my explanation. Don't worry about it, you know. The simplest explanation is she got better as she wrote, because in my opinion, the Uji chapters are maybe the greatest piece of. 2 quick facts about her. I'm going to come back to that top woodblock print in a little bit. You'll note that for Heian period, she was married rather late. If we accept 793 as her birth date, she was married late, and she had been with her father in the provinces, which was not good for a woman of her status to have any career at the court. She married late. She had 1 child who was actually politically much more successful than she was. She became the Menoto, the nurse to an emperor. That's Kenshi, or Ichigo no Ben is how she's known as a poet. And so Murasaki Shikibu was really, at the time that this is happening, was a very unlikely candidate to have written a work like this. Except for one thing. Her father, who was politically inept, it was totally politically inept. He couldn't really hold the job. He was a provincial governor, but that's not such a big deal. But he was really good at Chinese. And Chinese was the purvey, basically, of male courtiers. Women were not supposed to learn. I mean, there was a kind of social, tutting if you learned it. However, she obviously was very smart. And in her journal, she has a passage where she tells of sitting next to her brother as her father's trying to teach her brother Chinese. And she gets it, and the brother is kind of a dope and can't get it, okay? This never happened to her brother. Anyway, this happens a lot, okay? So it's not an unusual story. And her father is frustrated and is quoted in her diary as saying, just my luck, she wasn't born a boy. Well, that Chinese ability stood her in good stead, because it was one of the things that made it possible for her to write this story. Those of you who read it know that on the very first page, she's citing the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, the Bai Juyi poem. As a matter of fact, the whole plot is stolen from that. Well, it's a historic, so we'll get to that. So after he dies, the legend is that she went to Lake Biwa, Ishiyamadera, and she saw a moon over the water, and the Kannon Buddha appeared to her, and it's a miracle. Of course, none of this happened, but it's a miracle, and she started writing. And one thing that has to be true is that probably these early chapters were circulated around the court, because by 1005 or 1006, we're not sure exactly the date, she was then in service at the court. So those 2 things matter. The first is that she was not in the Fujiwara Regency line. She was lower level and had to struggle a lot in her early life. The second thing is her Chinese ability allowed her to begin writing this work, and it then secured her a position at the court. So this work is considered canonical, and I sort of urge caution about any canonical work. I think if you read a work like this because it's canonical, it's classic, then you're not coming at it with the right attitude. That's my feeling. In other words, you have to look at this as something, you have to be on the same level. If you're reading Shakespeare, okay, you can't put the work on a pedestal. You really have to come to it from your own experiences. You have to come to it from your own position historically. Now, in the end, you're likely to conclude it's pretty good writing, okay? Okay, so that's fine, but you're not just coming around and running around in a circle. You're coming around to a new place. And so this is always an issue for me to say, well, work is canonical. So why are works like the Tale of Genji canonical? This is not the only set of criteria you could use, but these are criteria that I think matter a bit. They come out of an established tradition, and they change the tradition. Okay? So think about the impact that the Homeric epics had in 5th and 4th century Athens. Okay? Or think about what they had when Virgil was writing the Aeneid. Think about it in those terms. But they fundamentally transform. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. The formal artistry is of a depth and it's of a quality that it can allow for multiple different readings within a single reader over time, but also obviously over time within a culture at large. Serves as a model for other artists across different media. This is on the cover. It was the cover that I chose for this. This is a Kyrie by Miyata Masayuki. Kyrie, that is not a painting. That is paper cutting. He's cut paper to do this kind of art. It's a remarkable kind of artistry. And so, no plays. If you look at the Tale of Heike warriors, they all want to be like the aristocrats. There's the parody, the man who loved love is a parody of the Genji. You have the Naka Genji, Nisei Murasaki, the country bumpkin Genji, and the Fate Murasaki, which is a massive bestseller in early 18th, 19th century Japan. So you get all this anime and manga. That's why I don't have any problems reading it through those. I mean, to step back for a second, when I say that those of you who've been working with Matt in his class, you really have read probably more of it than most Japanese will ever read of the Tale of Genji. And that's a good thing, okay? But then again, if you think about it, I just did this, it's a cruel trick. I asked the other day in my class, I asked how many of my students, how many of you read Hannah? Oh, you've read it. Oh, that's good. That's more than I got. That's more hands than I got in my class. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. But everybody knows Hamlet, okay? Hamlet is one of these works that you don't have to read to have read. Okay, it's like this joke about the country bumpkin who goes to see Hamlet for the first time, is totally stoked, amazed that Shakespeare was able to so smoothly work in all those famous quotations. So that's it, sir. The last two I think are really important here for me. They're intensely worldly and they're intensely provincial, which may sound funny to you. I know that some people, one of the comments, it was a very gracious comment that was made about the book from your student. There is a kind of universality. The humanity comes through, and that's true. But I'm always a little shy about using the word universal as a critical term, because that kind of pushes to the side the provincial, the parochial elements of a work that make it worth reading in the first place. Now, some of those elements you may find really strange. You may even find a bit shocking or appalling. That's okay. But at least what you're reading it for is for what it is, for the time and the place and the ideas and the emotions that it depicts. Finally, these books over and over again are intensely seductive. Now, seduction is at the heart of Genji in some ways because of all of his romantic encounters, or whatever complications. But the thing is, people get wrapped up in this. I mean, if you get wrapped up in Succession, don't see any problem with that because you find it seductive in a kind of narrative sense, that you're drawn to and it pulls you in. Great works do that. But then again, I have to sort of take my own statement with a grain of salt because I translated this work and I spent a lot of time. And then I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, is that self-serving or is this my own weird obsession? But I think in the end, when you look at it and compare it to other great works of literature, it's an important quality that makes something classic. Okay, so very quickly then, those of you who haven't read it, and those of you who had, this is going to be a quick run through. These are the major narrative arcs. That, by the way, is from the 1988 first anime version of this. Chapters 1 through 10, he has a lot of affairs. Okay, so those of you who read it know. But the most important ones he has are with Fujitsubo, who is, and this is important to my thinking about the Gothic elements of this. when Genji's mother is hounded to death and she dies at the beginning, right at the very beginning of this, and he's left as a kind of an orphan, he's being raised by his grandmother. The emperor is also grieving, and is really deep in grief. Mourning and grief are really, it's a very bright book in some ways, but in other ways, mourning and grief they permeate a lot of the plot in the book. And so he's really disconsolate, and then finally, one of the ladies in waiting say, "Oh, Your Highness, I know someone who would be a really good replacement for you, and it's this woman." And the big advantage she has is that she's actually a royal. She's in the higher ranks of the imperial family. She's a princess. She's a true princess. Genji's mother was not. She was too. Class really mattered in this book. It was really cruel because of that. Fujitsubo, the key thing is that Fujitsubo looks just like his mother. Okay, that's the key thing. Anybody seen Vertigo? The film Vertigo? You know what the story there is, and it gets repeated later in Genji. So Fujitsubo is the ideal woman. He's told by his father that she's the ideal woman because he knows that his mother was the ideal beauty. So he longs for her, and then it gets a little more than longing for her. They have an affair, and she just gets priggers, and they have the next crown prince. So this is kind of interesting. He's cuckolded his father with his stepmother. It's a fennel incest, not real incest, but it's a fennel incest. And he's interrupted the succession of the line of emperors. Now, the truth is, if all things had been equal, and if his mother had been higher born, Genji would have been in the line of succession. But he was devoted to a commoner. That's why he's called Genji. It's Minamoto, is the clan. So, I'll leave it there. Okay, that's enough. That's the big secret. And it's the one passage I'm going to read to you later in the talk, and you'll see what happens. His marriage is troubled. He's married at 12 when he comes of age. They have to have a wife born. His wife, who's known as Aoi in traditional naming, she is really unhappy. She's 16 years old. Her father is really powerful, and she was expecting for herself to go into the imperial palace and be a consort, maybe the mother of an emperor. Didn't happen to her. So she resents Genji. Genji feels inferior to her. It's a bad marriage. It's a really bad marriage. Finally, he gets another relationship going during this period, and that's with Murasaki, who's the niece of Fujitsubo, and who looks exactly like Fujitsubo. Okay, so you can see how this goes on and on and on, okay? And she's only 10 years old, so he takes her under his wing, so to speak, and he trains her to be a proper princess, to be a proper wife. I'm just the translator, okay? I'm not making a judgment one way or the other. Sorry, man. And so this relationship actually becomes the primary. She becomes his true love. It is a romantic story. It's kind of sad, but it's so these relationships go. He has one relationship too many. The mother of the crown prince, his older half brother, hates Genji's guts because his father, the emperor, always favored Genji. Right? And she was afraid, for political reasons, that he might bypass her son and let Genji be the emperor. So she's an implacable enemy. Genji, sometimes it can be kind of stupid, he decides to have an affair with her younger sister in her house. Okay. When they find out about this, they're disturbed. And he's exiled. So then you go through this period where you have a kind of a purification of Genji. I mean, a literal purification of him. He still has another affair with the Akashi lady, yet another lady is brought in. But that woman will give birth to the child who will become the empress and seal Genji's political fortunes. Okay. So the exile, he returned, he's restored. I'm going to have a quotation from book 20 near the end just to get to my key point here. 2033, these are the glory years. There's subplots focused on his son on Tamakazura. Then in 34, he takes one more wife, the third princess, who's very young, but he's doing it purely for political reasons. It's a big mistake. and he pays for it. And she gives birth to a son who's not his. She has an affair with the younger. And then Murasaki falls ill and passes away during this period. So this chaos of loss is where you ended the book. Okay, those of you who read it. Then there are the Uji chapters, and I'm not going to go into any detail here. This is the part of the book, though, that I find most interesting from this notion of what I'm going to call the Gothic sublime. Because this is the work that reminds me of Wuthering Heights. It reminds me of Vertigo. It's very much like Vertigo, where you find someone, a lost loved woman who dies, and you're inconsolable, but you find then a doppelganger, a lookalike, and you try to mold them. It's like, it's very much like it's like From Among the Dead. That's the book, the French book that Vertigo was made. It's very similar. So it's kind of an interesting sort of totally different switch. The only thing I want to say about them is that the reason I find them really kind of interesting is that you get much deeper into the characters. You get deeply into the characters in the first 41 chapters. That's the thing that seems so modern about her writing, the kind of psychology of the characters. But in this, it gets even deeper, and it does begin to read like a modern novel, because the time frame is compressed, the style is much more direct in some ways. But we'll leave it at that. So that's what the book as a whole is about. That's enough. So why was this book possible in the first place? So I want to just very quickly sort of give you a sense of the milieu at the court at around the year 1000 when this book was started. And so, again, most of you know, she was a Fujiwara, but she was not of the Regency line. It was a clan system. I mean, the way in which most of the ruling elites were parts of larger clans. Clans almost in the sense of like you would think of Scottish clans. Very, very similar sort of family, extended family groupings. And by the late 800s, the Fujiwara family had really gained dominance over the court. And they held on to that for almost 170 years. It was a long time that it was always a Fujiwara was the regent for the emperor. As a result, during this period, the emperorship itself as an office was greatly weakened. And it was mainly a ritual kind of office, if I can put it that way. Basically, the emperor was tied up all the time with the rituals of the court, literally every day of the year. And primacy of rank, well, I don't think I need to say anything more about this. But that's sort of the political stuff. And the reason that this matters is you can see this outline. So Fujiwara no Kanei was probably the most powerful man in the late 900s. His wife, Tokihime, gave him a whole bunch of kids, including Michitaka and Michinaga. And Michinaga in particular was the zenith of Fujiwara power. And as you can see, they had competing empresses. Michitaka's daughter, Teishi, or Akiko, if you want to call her by that name, the more Japanese style name, and Shoshi, Sadako and Akiko, so Shoshi is Akiko, they were both married to Emperor Ichijo. And again, Ichijo was a son of Kanei as well. I mean, it's all deeply interrelated here. Sei Shonagon, the author of the Pill Book, was a lady-in-waiting for Teishi, and Nosaki Shibukane actually taught Emperor Shoshi Chinese on the sly. Okay, was very close to her. And these were really, really talented women. Now, one last thing about this. You needed, because it's a kind of raw biopolitics at the court, you had to get proximity to the emperor to get power. And proximity, I mean physical, bodily. He needed heirs and he needed spares. Okay, he needed, and so that's why you have this kind of system where you have different salons. I mean salon literally I mean it in the 19th century Parisian salon. And you needed talented women, in particular, around the consort or the empress, because they had to produce poetry, they had to know ritual, they had all these things they had to do, the protocols of being a high-ranking aristocrat. And so you needed these shining lights. So it's no surprise that a woman like Sei Shonagon or a woman like Murasaki Shibu, they knew each other, would have come into the political mainstream this way. This is a very unusual sort of setup. I mean, that women would be so close to power in such a fundamental way, who are also women who are setting they are the locus classicus of Japanese literature. I can't think of another national literature, if you want to use that term, where women are the key authors. They're the ones that out of their works are really the fountain of so much that. I want to say something really quickly about the physical setting, the capital, because this is where they were, the seat of power. And I'm simply showing this to you because one of the things that's crucial about Murasakishi's work, literary, is that she owed so much to Chinese literature. The state itself, the Heian court, owed a lot to Chinese structures. It's basically the design is very, it's very geometrical. It's based on Chang'an. It's based on the great Tang capital. Okay, and all of the geomancy here, you had to have a mountain to the north and a river to the west, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, Japanese gardens, even now, landscape gardens follow this kind of magic of the topography. Okay. And then you see the court here, which was also modeled. You see these big areas in front. Let me see if I can point these out. This area, these are the shinden and the court. These are the formal governmental areas, and this is the area. Can you go to the next slide? This is the area where, again, the Heian-kyo projects power out, right? You've got the emperor at the top. You've got the Rashomon at the southern end. The court is divided into, the city is divided into right and left from the perspective of the emperor, right? And so it is a projection of a particular notion of political power. And it seems very bureaucratic. It is bureaucratic, it's rational, it's geometric. It's what you would expect if you were borrowing from China. But then that building behind is this. This is the old marriage politics, the sort of kinship politics. And you can see it again projected in the inner palace. It's like, where I would compare it to, it's not quite it wasn't quite as grand, but I would compare it to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Because basically what you've got is a harem. Right? And you have competing political families. It's, when you say harem, it always conjures, a particular image. But in fact, the harem is a kind of political structure. And so this is what's happening here. So this map, unlike the other, shows you the complexity of how you have a Chinese bureaucratic state placed over what is essentially, again, a very kinship-based kind of government. When I use the term, you put biopolitics in scare quotes, but there is a kind of raw bodily politics that's going on, and that shaped everything, and that certainly shaped the way the tale of Genji was written. Not just the plot, but again, the emotional sentiment, the moods of the place, the milieu is shaped by that. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want to point out that there are other ideologies. I'm counting, I might get scolded for this, I'm counting Confucian as a kind of religious because of the ritual elements, which are sometimes ignored. But I know I'm talking with experts in the room here, so I'll let it go at that. But no question that in real life, these two, Shinto and Confucian, were in effects, rituals were really important on the court. And I'm only mentioning this in passing, and you can see sort of these are all sort of simplifications of very complex systems, but you can see why these would matter. And if you read the book, you can recognize immediately some of the stuff that pops up here. Particularly purification, avoidance of defilements, taboos, directional taboos. You can't go on this direction on this day. You can't do this is all deeply sort of constructed out of Shinto practice, not belief so much, but practice. Similarly, the notion of human relationships and education. Genji educates his boy at the Daigaku, that's what it's called. And again, it's a very Chinese style of education. So you see the influences there. And again, I'm just going to spend a second on this. The Buddhist, I don't think I need to say much about this. If you've read the book, the Buddhist influences are everywhere. The key things here are these notions of mujo, of ku, mappo, that is the end of the law. All of these things are there. And in fact, I would argue that in two key places that you read, first, when Genji has the affair with Yugao in chapter 4, he's like Siddhartha, going out of the palace finally and seeing how the other 99% lived. And there's, he's fascinated by, oh, they have plants like this here, and they have bugs out here. And what are all these peons doing on the street? I mean, there's this sense of him as a kind of Siddhartha model. The second one is a more poignant one, and that's the death of Murasaki. Her villa is described as a pure land. The garden is it's like Amida's Pure Land in the West. And she herself, when it's finally described, her body, we never see her described in the whole book until she's dead. Then she's like a reclining Buddha. So these things are really deeply, deeply embedded in the texture of the narrative itself, but also these ideas of impermanence, of emptiness, are in conflict with the very values that made the court such a swell place to be. So the beauty of the here and now. Last thing, I don't have to say too much more about this. Again, Bai Juyi, but of course, the Yang Guifei, it's a really famous historical story, and it was the model. Here we go. Here's a painting. This is an Edo period painting of her. I think it's quite lovely. It's voluptuous. And again, remembering what in the first chapter, when the emperor is mourning the death of Genji's mother, he's looking for other examples of how you would handle this. And he's looking at scrolls with Yang Guifei. Okay? And this is the interesting thing. He thinks, wow, she's beautiful, but she's too beautiful. She's too arty. I could never, it's like me and Rihanna. I could never, it just would happen. It's not gonna happen. Okay, no matter what, just forget it. But this is the emperor, and he's saying, but what I remember is my sweet, precious Kiritsu. So it sets this kind of Wakan aesthetic out. There's the luscious, beautiful, he calls it beautiful Chinese art, but then he thinks about his own loss and his own love, and he thinks that's the preferable one. It's a more muted kind of beauty that he loves. As you can see, there's a famous Mizoguchi film, Yoki-hi, which is quite good. And then I just put that in because, of course, Yang Guifei wore a miniskirt. Fan favor, I guess. Next one. And finally, the literary setting. I just want you to sort of look at this. To me, the key thing is to see that this didn't come out of nowhere. If you remember my first point about what makes a canonical work, they don't come ex nihilo out of somebody's brain. Okay, they build on a tradition. And here you can see you have all of these different genres which are apparent in the tale of Genji. But she talks about the tale of the bamboo cutter in the contest of illustrations chapter, calls it the parent or the ancestor of the novel. The poetry is all the way through these mixed sort of the melding of different genres. It's very experimental. This is an amazing period of literary experimentation. Right. And so that's the one thing I want you to take away from it. Kagero Diary was extremely important. It is a kind of diary, it's more of a memoir. It was meant to be put together as a collection of poetry first, but then the woman, the mother of Michitsuno, we don't know any of these women's names, okay? Of course. And that was the way it was. So she writes this, and there's no question that her influence, particularly the subjectivity, talking about oneself, kind of autobiographical, memoir-like stories, added a level to the kinds of narratives that resulted in the Pillow Book and then the Tale of Genji. Now again, when I make these kind of comparisons, it's a bit facile. But just consider what is a classic of English work, of English language work at this time. I'm not knocking it, it's Beowulf, it's great. And Seamus Heaney's translation is beautiful, it's beautiful. But come on. I mean, the depth of the sort of psychological depth, the kind of subjectivity, what Matt, I know you've talked about with regard to the sort of feel, the sort of sensation of reading this, which leads to a kind of consciousness in the reader, or even the projection, a kind of theory of mind. that you can see these characters talking to each other, that they can see that there's a consciousness in each other. And that, I think, is a really important thing. Okay, so last thing, then you can read this in a lot of different ways. It's clearly a political novel. It's certainly lyrical. Not all of the poems are lyrical. Okay, let's be clear. They use poetry to insult, kind of rap, literally, and for all kinds of things. But it's generally, you could say that that's an important part of the mode. It's certainly critical and polemical. Realistic, yes, I'd say you'd have to say it's pitched at a more, what we would call a kind of realism, a kind of mimetic narrative. Satirical, for sure. I mean, I don't know how to handle, again, for those of you who haven't read it, I apologize. Those of you who have read it, do you remember chapter 3, Molted Cicada Shell, where he goes in and he's trying to consummate this relationship with a young woman who's a wife who has a much older husband, and she hears him coming and leaves, but her stepdaughter is asleep in the room. So he sneaks in and he's like cuddling up to her and he's realizing, well, wait a minute. And then she wakes up and the two of them go, oh, well, okay, why waste a good affair? I guess. So, when you look at this, some people get outraged. How could he have done this? And even the narrator says, well, this is, but the narrator also, you know, gets at the young woman too. Says, a woman with an ounce of experience would have understood he's lying through his teeth. But that's, who cares? I mean, that's what the story is. I have to think that they probably, the readers at that time, probably found it amusing. Okay, maybe not. I can't say for sure. And then here's what I have written about in that volume, this notion of necroromance, which is kind of an ugly term, but never mind. It's romancing the dead. And that's what I want to talk about here to end. A few more slides. Okay. So if I want to talk about the Gothic sublime, I guess the big question is there a conception of the sublime? The sublime now has so many overlays over the last 3 centuries, since the 1600s, when it was rediscovered as a classical notion. It comes from the word hypsos, which just means height or great height. You know, it's problematic in some ways to use this term because, in my view, the notion of the sublime that emerges in the 17th and 18th century, Burke, Kant, and then in the 19th century, it's entwined, in my view, with imperial notions of superiority of Europeans. Okay, they're the ones who can appreciate this. They're the ones who have the means to appreciate it. And oftentimes, if you take like a work like Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, it's in many ways a really weird book to read, but the poetry of his language, or I can put it that way, gestures toward the sublime when he's trying to describe the common. And you get this sense from it that there's something, that you're witnessing somebody experiencing the sublime. But it's deeply embedded in notions of imperial superiority, racism, that. So the word has become sort of problematic in my view. And the other problem, of course, is that it would be somewhat anachronistic to sort of think about Genji in these terms. But there are reasons why I think that I'm okay on safe ground. I've debated this for a long time, 10, 15 years. But then I read James Porter's book on the sublime in antiquity. It was 2017. And he made a couple of really important points. Number one, there's no word sublime that actually captures this. There's no one vocabulary word in the ancient world, in Greek and Latin, that actually captures that. There's a whole bunch of these things. And he goes and it's beautifully done. The book is really fascinating, actually. And he sort of delineates that. And so then I thought, okay, instead of looking for a one-to-one, let's think about the feeling. Again, the feeling that gets created when you think about the sublime. Okay? And in fact, if you look at it, there's tons of vocabulary that would suggest this. Sogon means a profundity. It means a heightened dignity. Suko, which is usually the word that's most associated with the word sublime, you can see by the second character, kol, takai, means height. It means, you know, something that's super high. Kolso means something that's really spread out. Ogosoka is the same thing as in Sogo. Kedakai, a feeling of height. Sozetsu, a feeling of total, absolute emptiness. Yugen, oops, sorry, that should be one N. Yugen. That's oftentimes a word that a lot of people over the years have said, well, that's sublime. It's usually associated with poetry or with the no theater. But what it actually means, if it's translated as mystery or profundity, I actually think it's better to translate it as obscurity, because it's a performance word in the no. And it means you're trying to create a sense of ambiguity, hide what's going on, to create a sense of depth behind the actors. Sugoshi, which means to be terrified. And of course, those of you who know Burke know that he locates the motivating emotion for the sublime as terror. I mean, it's really interesting. Remember, his essay is he's thinking about the sublime and the beautiful, and he's distinguishing those two terms. Okay. Sugomi, you see the same thing. Oware can mean all kinds of things. Okay. It doesn't just mean sadness. It can mean beauty. It can mean charm. It depends on it depends on the context. Anyway, enough of that. You can see markers of sublimity, and to some extent I borrowed from Porter's work on this, but this is stuff, people have talked about these kind of things a long time. Height, violent changes, so a thunderstorm can be, can create the affect of the spine. Fissures, chasms. For me, it's the absence of things. In my own view of the sublime, what the sublime does is when you have an experience of something that creates a sense of absence of light, absence of dark, absence of limits that you can't see. It's something you really, really cannot take in. And then one last thing is the sublime also is oftentimes used for those objects that embody these things, these forms. And it's interesting, I'm rambling now, sorry. But Emily Brady's recent book on the sublime in modern philosophy, she has a really interesting thing on environmental sublime, which is quite new and relevant. She argues there cannot be a sublime in any art, that no art is capable of producing the sublime image. I don't agree with that, but it's an interesting argument that it's only something in nature, something that is truly outsized and cannot be taken in. But I think if you move it down a little bit, you can see how poetry, painting, film can create moments that really are sublime, that you stop, you're pausing for a second, and you're not quite sure you can take all that in. So let me give a couple of examples of literary examples of this. This is a poem from Agemaki, chapter 47. Plovers cry mournfully at the water's edge, amidst an icy frost glinting bright and clear. How desolate a sound in pre-dawn. This is the kind of sugomi, that becomes really typical of medieval Japanese. This moment of desolation, of emptiness, even though the picture that is painted by the poem is quite clear. Then this is one of my favorite I don't know whether you feel sublime after reading the passage from Moby Dick, but what he's describing in some ways is the characteristic of the sublime that you cannot put into words. So the passage that comes from there, Pip, how many of you read this? This is another novel a few of you read Moby Dick. Okay. Pip falls, he wants to go out. He's a boy, he's about 13, 14, he's African American, and he's on the Pequod. And he's been as a servant, but now he wants to go out in the boats. And he goes out in the boats, and they come up to the first whale, and these are the harpoon boats, and he panics and he jumps off. So they stop, they row back, they pick him up. They get to the next whale, they actually manage to harpoon the whale, and he panics again and he falls in. And they don't come back. And he's out there for several hours in the middle of the Pacific. Right. And this is the passage, and this is a remarkable passage. The sea had jeeringly kept his finite body up, but drowned the infinite of his soul. Not drowned entirely, though. Rather, carried down alive to wondrous depths, where strange shapes of the unwarped primal world glided to and fro before his passive eyes. And the miser merman, wisdom, revealed his hoarded heaps. And among the joyous, heartless, ever-juvenile eternities, Pip saw the multitudinous, God-omnipresent coral insects that out of the firmament of waters heaved the colossal orbs. He saw God's foot upon the treadle of the loom and spoke it, and therefore his shipmates called him man. So man's insanity is heaven's sense. And wandering from all mortal reason, man comes at last to that celestial thought, which to reason is absurd and frantic. And weal or woe feels then uncompromised, indifferent as his come. So I don't know whether you feel like this. I feel like this pushes toward the sublime as a literary style. But whatever else you think, here's a description that is struggling to get us to understand Pip's madness. And in understanding that, he has experienced something that he simply could not take in, and human language, human experience cannot capture that. And I think this poetry of this passage is quite remarkable in that regard. Finally, I think Kant said it best: the sublime moves, the beautiful charms. There's a difference between these two emotions. Okay, so again, same sort of thing. In modern, in Western thought, I think it's a concept that people have come back again and again and again to, and I still think it's a productive concept. I'm not going to go into all of this here. I do think that the 18th century versions of this have echoed out and have really had a lasting impact. But you see here various iterations of what both Burke and then Kant follows Burke, by the way, on the notion of the sublime, right? And all of them get at this. And this, again, I've already talked about this. This is from that article. I think it's a paradoxical aesthetic state. It's almost an anesthetic state, produced by the perception of the essence of a thing or matter that cannot be taken in or described in any sensible form. It's a quality of perfect absence, in my view. And you see this, I think, in key areas all the way through. One last thing, there's a Gothic sublimity, which is what a sort of specific subset of this. There are a couple of things that I want to stress here. There's this excess repetition, which you see in Genji, a recursion over and over of the same story. He's caught in this recursive pattern of desire. It's an obsessive return to a forbidden life. And then I think David Morris, in an article that dates back to the 1980s, really explained it best. In exploring the entanglements of love and terror, the Gothic novel pursues a version of the sublime utterly without transcendence. It is a vertiginous and plunging, not a soaring sublime, which takes us deep within rather than far beyond the human sphere. And that brings me, this will be where I'm concluding. So thank you for your patience so far. So at the end of the Asagao chapter, there is a scene that I think in some ways encapsulates what Morris was talking about in terms of the Gothic sublime, and I think it gets you to some sense of how I'm thinking about the sublime as an aesthetic term. I mean, as a functional, aesthetic, critical, or analytical tool. All right, so Genji has unsuccessfully, and for the last time, tried to have an affair with Asagao, the lady of the bellflower. And she basically said no. So he's feeling a little depressed. All right. So now he's back with Murasaki, where he should be. And they're sitting, and it's in the middle of winter, and snow's fallen, and they're just chatting. And then you have this passage. Snow had piled up in the garden, and as it continued to flurry in the twilight, the transformation of the pines and the bamboo was a marvel. Genji's features seemed more radiant than usual. Now he's speaking. The cherry blossoms, he's below me. The cherry blossoms and the autumn foliage at their peak no doubt stir the human heart in their respective seasons, he said. But the sky of a winter night, when a full, clear moon illuminates the snow, is more profoundly moving than either, even though there is an eerie lack of color. It transports my thoughts to things beyond this world. It provides a moment when one can appreciate beauty and sadness to the full. Those who would claim that an evening like this is an example of something coldly forbidding have a shallow understanding of beauty. He had the blinds rolled up and moonlight streamed into every corner of the chamber, bathing it in a uniformly whitish glow. The poor withered plants in the garden were sagging beneath the weight of the snow. The burbling of the garden stream sounded as if it were sobbing in rain, and the ice on the pond was indescribably desolate. Genji sent page girls out into the garden to roll snowballs. That's by translation of it. It smooths out something here. Iwazu sugoki ni. Okay. So he's actually sending them out into the terror. Okay, it's actually not just the guard. He's sending them out into that. So a couple of things to note about this. Here, he's giving a notion of the sublime that seems transcendent. And I mean, that's kind of literally translated here. I mean, it transcends, it transports you to something beyond this world. And he's not actually separating it from the notion of beauty. He's enfolding it, and that seems to make sense for you. You can have excessive beauty. But then, note the images here. It's a complete whiteout. The moon is shining, there is no color in the world. It's a complete sort of whiteout. And then you have these desolate images as you had in that poem. All right, if that were all there was to it, all right, fine. But then right after this, about a page and a half later, Genji's been talking now. So after the girls, the break in this, it breaks the mood. The girls go out to roll these snowballs, and they roll them so big that they can't move them anymore, and the other girls are making fun of them. So there's a break. And then Genji and Murasaki retire, and they start talking, and they exchange very romantic poems about, mandarin ducks who are a symbol of fidelity and all this sort of stuff. And Genji starts talking about his past loves. I don't think, honestly speaking, I don't think I want a boyfriend like this. Let me tell you about all my dates. Okay, so he starts talking about all the women he's in his life, particularly Fujitsubo, who has recently passed. But then at the end of it, they exchange these poems, and Genji thinks, he looks at Murasaki and she's it. She's beautiful. She's the one. And then this happens. Right after, Genji went into their sleeping quarters and tried to rest. Still thinking about Fujitsubo, he's not quite asleep, not quite dreaming, when he saw a faint vision. She had an angry countenance. You swore you would never reveal our secret, she said, but you have not kept the matter hidden, and I have been shamed. I am suffering now in expiation for my sins, and I resent you for being their cause. Just as he was about to reply, he had the sensation of being assaulted. It's a spirit possession. Murasaki called out to him, "What's wrong? Why are you acting like this?" Genji was startled. He felt empty and his heart was beating furiously. As soon as he got his emotions under control, he realized that he had been crying. And even after he regained his senses, tears continued to soak his robes. Murasaki, wondering what had happened, was lying beside him, not moving a muscle. My heart troubled, I awakened from fitful sleep. How short my dream of this cold and lonely winter night. Now that would be a nice place to end that chapter, but it doesn't. He then thinks, well, I'm going to send out some priests to pray, and maybe I'll be reborn on the same lotus with Fujitsubo. And the narrator pops in and say, wow, what a deplorable thought. So the key thing here is that as with other supernatural moments in the text, there are a lot of them like this. This is why I picked this one. It's the sublime moment that triggers the supernatural. It's the sublime that pushes the experience of the characters in the text beyond this world into something else that they can't contain, they can't control, they can only try to describe it in this kind of poetry. All right, let me leave it at that, and let's take some questions. Yeah. So. It's fine. It's okay. Half an hour. Oh, okay. Fine. That's not terrible. So, can I just I'm really curious to see what some of you read, what you took away from the book. Not to talk about this, what I'm talking about, but any comments on it? Any questions about the work? Oh, don't be shy. You must have something. Yes.
So something that's been bothering me pretty much the whole work, and it's very Komokai. So I don't know. I noticed that when they're exchanging poems, they're choosing very carefully, like the paper and where it's from, and the color and the texture. And I was just wondering, how do you know much about where that comes from, or the historical? Because I kept wondering to myself, like, what's the meaning of this blue paper from Korea? Or
yeah, part of it is if you were wealthy and you were there, it was a sign of your taste. It was a sign of good taste. But a lot of those, if you go back and look at these exchanges, they oftentimes have specific seasonal
Yes.
or sometimes ritual meanings. So you see this in paper. Sometimes, okay, I'm going to get away from your question for just a second. Sometimes the paper takes on a plot device. So late in the Uji chapters, Neo is cheating with Ukifune on Kaoru. Kaoru loves, she's the rebirth of the woman he loves. She's the woman he's taking in as his revenant. Okay, and he's trying to train her. And the only reason he knows that the cheating went on is one of his aides saw a note passed with red paper, which was the kind of paper, it was more of a pink, it's the kind of paper you would write on if you were writing a love note. This had nothing to do with our use of paper. Okay. And so, he reports that he sees this letter, and because Kaoru is suspicious. And then at the court, he sees a messenger deliver Neo the thing with the red letter. He sees it. He doesn't have to read it. He knows now what's happened. And he knows that it's a love note. So you have all of these markers of class, of sensibility, of good taste. So another example would be the lady of the safflower lady, the woman with the nose. It's written in a nice story. Okay, but he's loyal to her to the very end. Okay, but he's a little shocked when he wakes up the next morning and realizes what she looks like, right? But the thing, it's not her looks that bothers. It's the fact she always chooses old-fashioned clothes. Her paper is always old, and therefore it's, instead of purple, it's gray. She's got no taste. Her calligraphy is blocky. And it's very old-fashioned. And so some of it is just a marker of taste, knowing what you have to do. So if you send a note out, sometimes it's not the note or the paper, it's how you're presented. So you might present it on a tray. If it's the fall, you'll present it with particular leaves or twigs. Spring, same sort of thing. So a lot of this is just a marker to show that you are well versed in what you should know as an aristocrat. Clothing is the same way. If I can say this, it's two things. Now I'm getting a little off topic here. Two things really were hard in translating this. One was the color of clothing, because they had they're redolent with meaning, and when he's giving clothing to particular women, you know, it's to reveal their character. It doesn't have like a seasonal thing. It's to reveal their character, and so there's a lot of research that's been done, but it's never certain about that. The other thing, when I was translating, I really wished I had done a degree in botany, because plants were all over the place, and the names of these things are really hard to get. And again, they matter for exactly the point, because many of them have they're not just seasonal, general, they're very specific meaning, as does the coloring and the weight, and actually how you write your brushstrokes. You can still be very fluid and very feminine, but if you let the ink trail off, that's very sexy, okay? Or it can be very there can be implicit meanings there. So all of that meant something, and I think one of the one of the glories of this text is how much she delves into the material culture of the court. And I think one of the things that has always fascinated readers over centuries, at least in Japan, was this attention to this super detail. When you get into more modern novels, early 19th century novels, I'm thinking of something like Pierre Goriot. I don't know if anyone's ever read that particular novel. The first 50 pages is just an extensive description of the guy's apartment. I mean, it's really long. When we assigned this once to our students, they were really mad. Can we get out of this guy's apartment? But everything mattered, if you see what I mean. So you're good to pick that up, because it does matter how explicit you can make that in terms of interpreting. I'm myself, sometimes I don't know. But yes, I mean, I think the key thing is class mattered and knowledge mattered to them. And that was more than anything else, that's the overriding concern.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you actually sort of touched on it with this discussion that you just had.
Right.
And you mentioned the idea of theory of mind.
Yes.
And something that struck me about the work is how so much is communicated through poetry. Specifically, it's not communicated, it's implied.
Yes.
I feel like that sort of enforces the development of theory of mind. You have to get in the minds of the characters to fill in the blanks, basically read between the lines.
Yes.
And then
That's a smart comment. Thank
this
you.
ties together to something else that you said, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, but you mentioned before that the Uji chapters you believe are better written. And another comment you made offhand was that it reads more like a modern novel. I'm not saying you're not trying to connect those
No. I say a lot of things off.
but I read only select chapters and none of the Uji chapters. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the differences, if that maybe
Okay.
poetry's still there, what makes it different?
Again, what makes it different? You'll know one quirk, and again, these are things that, trust me, I lost sleep over and debated. I put, because thoughts, interior thoughts, are marked grammatically. They're marked in the book, or in the original. I mean, it's in pen, I guess you'd say. What I think the difference is that there's more of it. And you really, there are times where you see this in the early chapters. I think one of the most famous examples is with Lady Dokujo in chapter 9, when she realizes that it's her living spirit that's going out and torturing Genji's wife while she's pregnant. And she has these dreams of a woman beating her up and strangling her, and her robes smell of poppy seeds because the priests are burning poppy to drive out, to exorcise these spirits. But then you get her, then put all that aside, then you get in her mind. And this is a vulnerable, hurt person. And you see it, you're deep in her mind. And you can think of, you don't have to come up with a modern psychology. Spirit possession is a kind of psychology to explain how people are acting, what happens to them. But in that case, you see how you're sort of deep into her. And she's kind of here's a case where she's reading herself and she's trying to figure out how other people are seeing her. And that's her obsession at this point, because she was disrespected by Genji's wife, and she was a woman who you don't disrespect. She should have been an empress. So her case is a very sad case, the crown prince that she was married to died. All right. So she's frustrated, you see that. What happens in the Uji chapters is that gets even more, that's more central to the entire text. So Kaoru is someone who knows, he's heard rumors that he's not really Genji's son. And so then he thinks, okay, well, the hell with this. Why do I need to deal with this? I will put most of my thought, I'll do what I have to do to be a courtier, but I'll really focus on the next world, on the enlightenment and the religious stuff. And then he betrays all of that with his love for the older Uji princess. He betrays that, then she dies, then he's betrayed again with his dog, with Ukifune. And all the way through, you see this with Ukifune. And it's not just that they're deep in their minds and sort of thinking, oh, woe is me. They're worried about how the world around them is thinking about them. So they're gazing at people, but they're also aware of people gazing back at them. And so as a result of that, you get a complexity in the sort of how character begins to develop. And you see it in Genji. I mean, you see it even in the early chapters. You see that, but it becomes more compressed. And again, I would compare it to something like, to Vertigo. I mean, if you look, I don't know how many of you have seen the films, no plot spoilers here, but the James, Scotty is the main character, and then Judy is the woman he's trying to make over, and then he gets it. He never sees Maddie, the woman he loved, die. Okay, so he's haunted by this. He's haunted by the fact that he couldn't save her. And then at the end, he gets to see Maddie die. He recreates her and she falls. And you have that scene where James Stewart is looking into an abyss. Okay, you're kind of witnessing somebody experiencing this sublime moment. And what happens there is that, Hitchcock goes deep and deep and deep in all sorts of ways to get you into his mind. But Scotty is also trying to he's a detective, and he's trying to calculate everything. And that's what you see more of, I think, in the Uji, how these characters are really trying to gauge each other. They're really feeling each other out. And there's some of that in Genji, but I feel like to some extent the conception of Genji as a character precluded Murasaki. This is a guess. This is total speculation. But I think that her conception of Genji, he doesn't age. He's always beautiful. He's always top. Even though the narrator says, am I praising him too much? He's always jumping in and saying, maybe now people, I've always said how good he is. Now people think I'm talking too much about him and gossiping. There are all these comments all the way through by the narrator. And the reason is, I think, is that if you were thinking of it in terms of Murasaki Shikibu as the author, her hands are tied a little bit by such a character. There's a kind of magic quality. He knows his karma is too good and nothing bad's going to, he says at several points, my karma is good, nothing's going to happen. He tells Yuga just before she dies, don't worry. They're going to go they're not going to hurt me. Well, no, they didn't hurt you. They hurt her, right? And so, his character is like hard to control. So she can't even kill him off. I mean, it would have been a bad stroke to kill him off. She's not like Logan. Okay. Lots spoilers here, okay. She couldn't kill him. So whether you believe that she actually had that blank chapter or not, I don't know. But there's a blank chapter, Kumogaku, hidden or eclipsed by the clouds. And it's sort of, again, those of you who might know Tristan Shandy, he's got 2 blank chapters, chapter 18 and 19 in the book. And it seems like a bit of a stretch, but even if she did it, it would be really brilliant. But she can't do it. The title says it all. The radiant one is now eclipsed. And then the next chapter picks up, the radiant Genji's passed away and there's nobody in the next generation who's anything like him. Which then freed her up to do more, sort of, in my view, freed her up to do more of this kind of deep sort of dive into the psychological.
More human, yes.
Yes.
So I think it kind of goes without saying that the tale of Genji just really, really digs into themes of incest and just a lot of different things with that. So so reading it really made me think a lot about the morality of incest and how it was seen throughout history. And so one thing I found confusing was just how varying the opinion on incest was throughout the court, specifically in the relationship between Kumoe no Kari and Yugiri when they were first getting together. Well, when they had the tryst as children together, or as younger people together, they ended up, Tomo Chujo, I think, found out about it and was like, well, they're cousins.
Playing doctor at a very young age.
Yes. And he says, I believe the line was, well, they're cousins after all, saying, negatively, why would they get together?
But it's not, but the rap there was not that it was incest. The rap there was that, every cousins marry all the time. There's nothing special about that marriage. The question of incest here is interesting. People debate this a lot. I think in the case of Fujitsubo, there is a term for this. It's affinal incest. If you sleep with your stepmom or your stepdad, whatever. That's called affinal, but it's not like incest, the way we would say Oedipal sort of stuff like sleeping with your mother. The thing is, it's complicated. I'm not trying to make a defense or anything else. I think you have to put this in context. These are very, very extensive clans. And first of all, let's be clear about this. Cousin marriage is globally common. And it's common in many parts of the world now. Okay. We had a president who married his third cousin. Franklin married Eleanor. They were cousins. She didn't have to change her name when they married. I think, again, it sounds like I'm being flip. I'm not. If you weren't appalled by some of the actions in this book, then I would be appalled. If you weren't appalled, okay? But on the other hand, the clan system, it really was not considered incest in the way we would think. It's like brothers and sisters. That didn't happen. There were taboos against that. But in a large extended clan, it was just a more acceptable thing and not such an uncommon thing. I think the other thing that bothers, at least in my experience teaching this text, I don't know about you, Matt, question that comes up is how young they are. And this always comes up with Murasaki, because she's 10. He doesn't do anything with her. Everyone thinks he's a perv. He's worried that everybody thinks he's a perv. I mean, it's explicit in the text. They're thinking, yeah, are you sure about this? She's only, do you really know how old she is? And he's thinking, oh my God, what are people going to do? He's robbing the cradle. He says that. And it's a stolen bride. These are the images he associates with him. But again, I would, it's not so far out of the range of human experience that you can't sort of move beyond that to understand the art of the work. I think that does matter. I mean, after all, if you look around, there are a lot of states in this country that a woman can be married when they're 13, 14. It's not so old, and I since he passed away, God bless him, Jerry Lee Lewis.
I was just about to say.
Yeah, there you go.
13-year-old
Cousin.
cousin.
Yeah, and that wrecked his career for a while. This was back in the 50s, back in the good old days. We had some morals in this country. Seriously, it was like, so it's not like, it's just not out of our understanding. That's the only way I can put it. But again, when I read it, is there a yuck factor, a yuck factor? Did you feel that way or not?
I mean, obviously it was a little jarring, especially like in the relationship between, like when Kashiwagi is going after Tamakazura. Obviously, I was a little like jarred when I was like,
well, because they're brother sister, and he finds out, it's like, whew.
Yeah, and he actually like becomes very like sweet to her and like the way of like aiding her. But going off of what you said about children and like how oftentimes they were sexualized throughout, like just even throughout Japanese history, like looking at the, I'm familiar with Dr. Schmidt-Bory's work.
She's my colleague.
Yes, especially with her novel Tales of Idolized Boys and the concept of the Chigo. So, do you think that perhaps that the fact that childhood is a state of life that's impermanent, do you think that maybe that has to do with the fact of like them really enjoying and oftentimes like young boys were compared to women in their like attractiveness. So I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
Well, for one thing, the ideal male beauty is not what we would think of the hirsute male, the bearded, muscular male. Genji is beautiful. This is part of Sachi's work. Genji is an ideal beauty because he has a kind of feminized face but a masculine body. And that's the ideal in Japan. You still see that. I mean, you can see that in the idol groups. BTS, any BTS fans? Okay, good. All right. At least we got some honesty. All right. And there is, the Chinese government is angry about this. Sissy boys that. It's strange, actually. But he was that beauty in the first chapter. The emperor, when they cut his hair, when they cut Genji's hair, he's afraid, oh my God, he's not going to be beautiful anymore. And then he becomes masculine. So there are these. But I have to say, sexualized, I want to push back a little bit on that. I'm not sure it's sexualizing children. I think that's not quite what's going on. This isn't grooming. The Chigo that you mentioned, this was a medieval phenomenon several centuries after this. These were acolytes that were brought into temples, and they were, in some ways, it was the sort of pederasty you would have seen in ancient Greece. That's not it's not a perfect comparison, but it's pretty close, actually. So they were oftentimes groomed, but I mean groomed in a more positive way. They were sort of promoted, not always, but sometimes. And so there was that kind of, we look at it as a kind of exploitation. And I think in some cases it was. Sachi and I disagree about that. I mean, this was more an accepted practice that was to the benefit of the family. In some cases, yes, it was true, but in not all cases. I want to be a little careful about the notion of sexualizing, because this is the image we have of modern Japan, right? I showed you that thing. the strip where you have Yang Guifei as this other kind of woman, and young women do, I think, get this sexualized in a really kind of unfortunate way in contemporary. Other questions? Oh yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So we see Genji, go from a baby to an adult, and throughout the time, he loses lovers, things. But I feel like only once he loses Murasaki in the first part of the book,
Yes.
I feel like he's truly sort of lost himself. And I feel like after that, he's only spent a brief period of time with him after he loses Murasaki. But I feel like he's sort of no longer at Genji throughout that time, right? And sort of getting to that feeling of the sublime, terror aspect.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think your reading of that is spot on. I think that for me that chapter Maboroshi, which I translated as spirit sunger.
Very sort of haunting chapter.
Yeah, it's beautifully written. It's a lot of poems in that chapter, and the title refers back to chapter 1. His father is hoping for. He's thinking about Yang Guifei, and the Chinese emperor sent these Taoist priests to try to summon her spirit back, and they're called Maboroshi. And so the whole novel has kind of circled back on itself with just the title. But it's also the first time, and now I'm speaking just totally personally, it's a personal read of this. It's the first time that I kind of really, I'm sort of with Genji. I mean, he seems more human and he's devastated here. He really did lose the woman he loved, fine. And he has to acknowledge that. And the chapter, for those of you who haven't read it, it's worth reading on its own as a separate chapter. It starts with the new year and it takes you through the year. So his grief gets displaced. He's like bodily displacing himself onto the seasons, the poetry, the customs of the court, and he plays it out. And it ends with him thinking, okay, now that we're at the end of the year, we've done the year-end celebrations, I'll think of new things for the future. But you never see that, of course. You never see that. And so there's this sense of him, in some ways, you could say that he embodies that structure of feeling that I talked about at the beginning. He really embodies it. But of course, his body itself is the text, really, for that first 41 chapters. And it all comes to that final chapter. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a very different style of writing because it's so heavily poetic. But it's very moving. It's very beautiful. Thank you.
One more.
One more? Okay, in the back.
So for any aspiring translators in the room, could you talk a little bit about your history as a translator and the evolution of your command of the Japanese language?
I'm still learning. So my wife is a Japanese language teacher. She reminds me of that every day. And so, it's really hard. I mean, translation is one of these tasks that it has to be to some extent a labor of love. That sounds kind of mawkish, but I don't mean it that way. It's because in some ways I've translated modern novels as well. I always feel ambivalent about it because in the book, in the introduction, I think I explained some of my feelings about it. I'm really ambivalent about it. It's like the text that I've given you is a palimpsest. And what I've done is I've kind of pushed all the Japanese words off and written over in English. And that's great. I mean, that's good. I think you gain stuff. I don't think translation is always a loss, but it's certainly a transformation. And the idea that I think the one thing that I've always, as a matter of humility, is I can't recreate that. I'm not a writer like her. You can't. You do the best to create it, the English as a work of literary art, and that's kind of what I was always trying to think about. How do you get this as a work of art in English? So that's why my poems don't look like. I felt like 5757 that syllabic structure of a tanka, of the key poetic form, that fits Japanese prosody because that's Japanese. It doesn't fit English prosody. And so what I was trying to do was, more than anything, I started with a very literal translation, which was unreadable. And then, and this is because Matt, you're working on this. This is why I find interesting. Then in the second iteration, this is why it took so many years. I would go read the thing out loud, try to get a feel that just the sweep, the rhythm in English of the Japanese, because the sentences are quite long and complex. So you try to get a sweep of that. And at the same time, you're trying to hear voices, this is gonna sound insane, voices in your head. You're trying to hear what would they sound like in English. So, you match, you think of actors who would be in a role and you try to feel that. And it's not just semantic, it's this underlying feel of, the stuff you're working on. It's this underlying feel of the prose that I was trying to capture. And in the end, I'm sorry, this is not false humility. I don't know. I mean, I did the best I could. And I think it is, I tried for this readability, this accessibility, because I felt that her style is really powerful and really strong. And I feel that's the one thing that if I were to separate my work from other translations, I think it's on that score. While I was translating, I translated a couple other books because I translated a great modern novelist, Tsushima Yuko, passed away a few years ago, and she's a great novelist. And I wanted to hear her voice, and I would read, not because I could write like them, and I'm being totally honest about this, but I reread a lot of Toni Morrison, I reread A.S. Byatt, whose styles I thought in parts would capture what I was feeling in the rhythm of the original Japanese. So again, I'm going to be really cautious about that. That would just be ridiculous. I'm writing like Toni Morrison. No. But I wanted to hear that in my head, and I wanted to hear particularly modern women writers in Japan. And Tsushima is noted as an important, she's a really important writer, period. But her stories are all about her experience in life. And so I wanted to feel that. I wanted to hear these other voices, but coming out literally a sound through the text. So I don't know if that's probably so obscure that anybody, translator is probably thinking, what is this all about? I think you just take it as it comes. I know that sounds really ridiculous, but that's kind of how I did it. It wasn't easy. I had a lot of nights where I woke up at 2 in flop sweat. Oh my God, is this ever going to be over? That should discourage you. No, it really should discourage you because it's an unbelievably rewarding thing. You're in somebody else's world. You're seeing how they build the world. It's great.
So I think that's a good note to end on, and Dennis, what you've given us is great. Thank you so much, and we're going to let you off the hook. So let's go to the final round.